lying when I said we'd spend a long time here because this chapter is a doozy. In the next section, Tripp has a segment called Called to Be in Charge. And I just want to point out, and I might even put text up when I edit this, of the train of thought by which he's taking parents down. And I'm going to skim right over it and number them. So he goes through in this segment, this 2-page segment, and he's telling parents, one, you have authority because God calls you to be an authority. You have authority to act on behalf of God, that you are exercising God's rule in the life of your child. He's essentially just rattling those things off, one right after another. There's no discussion. This is just presented as a given. And I'm going to pause in our list there to say, according to these claims, there's a subjective standard because he's offering a disclaimer. This authority is bounded by your ability to act in a way that pleases God. But how is that defined? It's either going to be defined by what Tripp is saying, but ultimately it's left up to the parent's subjective interpretation. So this could mean that a very cautious, thoughtful parent is very guarded in their use of authority. This can also mean all the way up to tyranny and egregious abuses that parents believe, well, but I'm acting as God's agent of authority, and it can escalate with no cap. So this is a really irresponsible trajectory to lead parents down, because essentially it's saying you are God in the life of your child. You act as an agent of God. You have the authority of God. In fact, you have the command of God. Your choices are God's choices in the life of your child. He says this quite clearly at the end of the page. He says, you are commanded to function on God's behalf. You are God's agent. He uses this language of agent, function, authority over and over and over again. And then he takes it into discipline and says your right to discipline your children is tied to what God has called you to do, not your own agenda. So all of this authority language is a setup to say, when you discipline, you are acting as God's authority in the life of your child. On your background, this may sound like standard fare from Christian parenting resources, but there's no biblical evidence or theological support given in this trajectory. I really need you to see that this is these 2 pages, and what we get as far as biblical support is a reference to Genesis 18:19 pulled out of context. He does give it to us in the text. He says, Jehovah says, I have chosen him, Abraham, so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just. That's the verse. That's the quote. And he says, Abraham is on God's errand. He's performing a task on God's agenda. I was fascinated the first time I saw Genesis 18 show up in Christian parenting literature. And this isn't the only place, but I am kind of curious to know if this was the first place. It is such an astonishing thing to take a narrative portion of a specific promise, a covenant promise given to Abraham as the patriarch of Israel, and say this applies to all people as a claim on their authority. And it's often used as a prosperity gospel parenting promise to say that the legacy, that if a Christian father does this, he can kind of count on a family legacy. Doug Wilson does this and others with this verse. This is just very extraordinary, hermeneutically speaking, to pull in there and grab this specific promise made to Abraham. This is a promise about God making Israel his chosen possession and a special treasure, that through Israel, all nations on earth will be blessed. This is a very specific promise. It is not a name it and claim it general statement about the immediate family, an immediate family, like a nuclear family in the way we think of it, or about what parents can expect. Pops in here is a reference to Deuteronomy 6, which he doesn't quote, but this is, if you'll remember, this is instructions to the people of God in Israel to say, you will instruct your children when you sit down, when you rise, when you go about your daily life, you're teaching them about the Lord. So he kind of references that in passing and references Ephesians 6:4 in passing, the instruction that follows, fathers, do not embitter your children, but bring them up in the fear and instruction of the Lord. He's saying those Bible verses mean you function on God's behalf. I I don't know what it's like hearing this on the other side of the screen, but I look at that and think that is quite the leap in logic to say, because of this specific promise made to Abraham, because of instructions given to the people of God in Israel to essentially catechize their children and teach them about the Lord, because of this direct instruction to New Testament Christians to teach their children about the Lord, we function as gods in the life of our children. That's the leap. It's not that parents do. I do think it's a biblical principle that we see even in Deuteronomy and Ephesians, that parents would instruct and teach their children. But to go from that to functioning as gods, to acting in godlike ways, is classic to this book. This is what it all hangs on. I think this is the justification for so much of what follows.